Hello, everyone. Warm welcome to our IIASA public webinar. I will be your moderator today. My name is Elena Rovinskaya. I'm Program Director of Advancing Systems Analysis Program at IIASA, the program that focuses on innovation in methods and data for systems analysis. I'm also coordinating IIASA's Transformations Within Reach project. This is our 8th event in the series that showcases the work of IIASA to the public audience. IIASA is an international research institute with 22 national and regional member organizations, which represent over 60% of the global population and almost 70% of the global economy. IIASA conducts policy-oriented research into global challenges which arise from economic and technological development, such as climate change, natural resource management, or rising inequality, to name just a few. Our researchers treat such problems with the lens of a systems approach, which is operationalized through the use of systems modeling, participatory research, and policy analysis. This allows to view problems holistically, recognizing the interconnectedness and interdependencies among various actors, factors, and components. IIASA researchers work hard to enhance science-informed policymaking. This includes working side by side with policymakers to devise feasible policy options. And increasingly, it also includes engaging with the general public. And indeed, addressing the multitude of challenges related to sustainability faced by the humanity today requires collective action of all major stakeholders, including businesses, governments, and citizens. Science has played a crucial role in generating knowledge that underpins our current living standards and reveals vulnerability of our systems to external and internal shocks, such as pandemics, technological advancements, or climate change. Given the modest progress, measured, for example, by the dynamics of many of the SDG indicators, we ask ourselves, is science doing enough? Is the role of science confined to providing impartial knowledge? Should science and scientists be more active or proactive in shaping stakeholders' view on global challenges and possible pathways? Would such a shift in the approach strengthen or deteriorate the credibility of science? What is the most effective way of infusing science into decision-making at the time? We will address these questions in our webinar today. We will hear the perspectives of 3 experienced IIASA scientists and invite the audience to engage in this conversation by providing comments and questions using the Q&A function of the webinar. My colleagues will also send around a short survey at the end of the event, and we would be hugely grateful if you can take a few minutes to fill out this survey. I'm delighted to start the seminar, and now I would like to introduce our speakers today. Let me now introduce Lena Höglund Isaksson. She is a senior research scholar in Energy, Climate and Environment program at IIASA. Lena had developed the methane module of the GAINS model of IIASA and is coordinating various policy applications involving non-CO2 greenhouse gases, for example, non-CO2 emissions and mitigation scenarios as an analytical input to the EU energy and climate policies, and also various global assessments of cost-effective non-CO2 mitigation strategies. Lena co-authored over 60 peer-reviewed publications and contributed to several flagship policy reports, such as, for example, UNEP's Global Methane Assessment, several IPCC assessment reports, and reports for the Arctic Council's Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program. Lena is a member of the Scientific Oversight Committee of the UNEP's International Methane Emissions Observatory, and in her current research, she is interested in understanding the boundaries for methane mitigation and how to deal with barriers. How can they be overcome, and covering different kinds of barriers, from technical to behavior, institutional, and political barriers. Lena, welcome to this seminar. We look forward to hearing your perspective. Now, let me introduce Nebojša Nakičević. Nebojša, or Naki for short, is the deputy chair of the group of chief scientific advisors to the European Commission and the director of the World in 2050 project. He is emeritus and honorary scholar and served as IIASA's deputy director general for many years and also as acting director general. He is also a tenured professor in energy economics at Vienna Technology University and holds various different advisory positions. Just to name really a few, he is a member of Academia Europaea. He is also a member of Montenegrin Academy of Arts and Sciences, Earth League, Earth Commission, multi-stakeholder technical group of Sustainable Development Goal 7, and various advisory boards, both in the private and public sector. So again, to name just a few: Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, Japanese Institute of Environmental Studies, German Airspace Center, and so on and so on. Various positions Naki holds. He also serves on editorial boards of 10 peer-reviewed scientific journals. And his current research interests include patterns of technological change, including the evolution of energy, mobility, digital technologies, economic development, and climate change. Naki, welcome. We are looking forward to hearing your thoughts and perspectives today. Let me now introduce Piero Visconti. Piero is a research group leader at IIASA of Biodiversity, Ecology, and Conservation Group. His research combines methods from systems analysis, global change biology, conservation biogeography, spatial planning for biodiversity conservation and restoration. And he uses these methods to answer scientific questions, but also to provide policy support. He co-authored over 70 peer-reviewed publications in leading international journals, including several in Nature and Science. He has been coordinating lead author of the IPBES Global Assessment of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services for Europe and Central Asia, where he led the chapter on the status and trends and future scenarios of biodiversity and ecosystem services. Piero also has been president for the Society for Conservation Biology European section in 2012-2015. He was a president of the local charity Rewilding Apennines, and national partner, which is a national partner of Rewilding Europe, and now is a member of the advisory board of this organization. He regularly advises the European Commission on matters related to nature conservation and engages with the Commission and national decision makers through various research projects focusing on identifying priority areas for conservation and restoration at local and national level. Piero, welcome to this webinar. We are curious to hear your thoughts as well. Welcome. So now, after I have introduced all speakers, I would like to invite them to first give their perspective as a short presentation and tell us a little bit about your experience in working on the interface of science and decision making. All of you have that experience. So please share it with us. What were the challenges? How were you able to overcome those challenges? And anything you think the audience can benefit from to hear from you. So I would like to invite Naki to speak first.
Thank you, Elena, also for the kind introduction. And I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation to participate in this webinar. Let me just start with the following observation. I think that we need to see science in a broader sense. It needs to involve technology, medicine, and all forms of knowledge, because arguably, these have been all at the center of human development, at least since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And I think it's probably true that they will be at the core of human development in the future as well. So I would argue they will be central for achieving safe and just future for the people and the planet. So in some sense, one could say that without science, there is no future. At least that is my point of view. However, there are major challenges, and this is what I want to talk about. 3 of them in particular that come from my own experience. I would even go so far to call them paradoxes. So first, evidence-based science advice takes time. This has been my experience as the chief scientific advisor to the European Commission, also as chief scientist of Montenegro, in the IPCC in particular, since the first assessment report, and more recently, global energy assessment. This is just to mention a few efforts that were directed at facilitating decision-making. But so what is the paradox? The paradox is that policy needs immediate answers, and science needs time. And I think the only way to bridge that, in my view, is that the scientific communities generate knowledge well before policy perceives the problems and challenges. So that means we need forward-looking science, inquiry-based research that can help identify emerging problems. And arguably, IIASA has been very successful in that over the last 50 years. And I think climate change is a good example in general, but also at IIASA. We have had pretty solid science on climate change for about half a century. But unfortunately, there is a chronic lack of action to avoid dangerous climate change. So I think this is our dilemma. The second paradox is, I would frame this way: science has discipline, but the world has problems. Now, I think also ministries and private sector have departments, so it's not unique to the science. But I think, as you said in the introduction, Elena, we need holistic approaches. And that means interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research. That means systemic and integrated research. And again, I believe that IIASA has been pretty much in the lead in taking this kind of innovative research approaches ever since its inception, pretty much 50 years ago. So I think one can think of a possible metaphor how it needs to look like. Think of the capital letter T. So the vertical are the disciplines. They're an absolute necessary pillars of science. Without them, nothing works. But also the horizontal is important. And without disciplines, there is no horizontal. But I would argue that for the science advice in this polycrisis phase of the human development, we need this kind of horizontal evidence-informed scientific advice. Think of all of the problems facing humanity, from geopolitical changes to the pandemic, from war to the economic crisis. So I think this is my second paradox. And the third one is that the future is inherently unpredictable, yet science and engineering communities need to provide advice on the way forward, and hopefully on the way forward to a better future. So in the past, I would argue that the way the science did this with how science hedged against the uncertainty of future is to look at a wide range of future options. I call those, in case of modeling runs, spaghetti curves. They go from minimum population to maximum population, minimum emissions to the maximum emissions, and cover a very wide range. But I would argue that today's situation has changed. We have a global vision where we want to go. I would say that's characterized by the 2030 agenda and its 17 sustainable development goals, by the Paris Climate Agreement, European Green Deal, and so on. So I think that the foresight function of the science and engineering, scenario building, pathways, and roadmaps all need to provide evidence way of how to achieve those, in which way and how to achieve these goals. So I think that is the new challenge to the scientific communities, how this can be done and how to get there. And I think this is a way of hedging against fundamental uncertainties, of trying to describe how we can achieve those goals, because at the end of the day, they will also depend on the human intentionality. So let me close my opening remarks by quoting Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel Prize winner economics, who said that not having a plan is also a plan, but usually not a good one. Over to you, Elena.
Thank you, Naki. Thank you so much. We will come back to some of the points you made in the discussion session. But thank you for now for this insight. I would like to pass the floor now to Lena. And Lena, please share your perspective on how you worked in science and policy, and also what kind of challenges you observed there and how to possibly we could overcome those challenges.
Thank you, Elena. And thank you for inviting me to this webinar. So I will speak about my rather concrete experience with working with the European climate change policy processes, because IIASA's GAINS and Globia model teams have for over 15 years now provided direct analytical input to the European air pollution and climate policy processes. And this has been done as part of a wider European research consortium consisting of 5 different models and institutes. And the GAINS model results have here been in the form of non-CO2 emission and mitigation scenarios. and abatement cost curves, which have then been used by the European Commission for the development of, for example, impact assessments, like the Green Deal and the Fit for 55 proposal, including also for the setting of legally binding national emission reduction targets. And our role here is to be an independent expert partner to the Commission in these processes. And this means that we model future emissions mitigation potentials in a consistent manner across member states and for different stakeholder groups, such as different industries. And the DG Klima, which is the partner in the European Commission, organizes different stakeholder meetings where our results are then discussed and feedback provided, which we then, of course, consider and take on board all well-documented feedback that we get and do updates accordingly, as long as they also maintain the consistency in the modeling. And it also includes being on constant standby for any questions from the Commission or from different stakeholders on these topics that may arise during this process, which usually is a 2-year policy process round. And for the scientific validation, we regularly publish results, usually as global assessments, and also take part in different international expert committees on non-CO2 greenhouse gases. And in my experience, there are at least 3 important requirements for successful science to policy work. And the first one is trust, that the Commission and various stakeholders, they need to be able to trust in our expert knowledge on these topics. And the second one is transparency, that we need to present results and assumptions as clearly as possible and be available for any questions and feedback and consultations with member state experts to explain our results, often to investigate reasons for any discrepancies to national estimates, and also to be prepared to improve and update whenever new information becomes available. And when there is uncertainty, we need to be open about it and agree on a way forward together with the stakeholders and the Commission. And the third one is timing, because policy processes don't wait. So we have to deliver on time to the best of our knowledge, because otherwise our work becomes useless for the process. And perhaps I should also add the fourth requirement, which is teamwork, because it's necessary to work interdisciplinary and to collaborate smoothly across different subjects and between models. Thank you.
Thank you, Lena. Thank you for sharing these initial thoughts. And also, I'll have further questions to you in the Q&A session. But before we go there, thank you very much again for that. And let me ask Piero to share his experience and his take on the challenges and how these challenges could be overcome. Piero?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Elena. First of all, I would like to second everything that my colleague said, the 3 paradoxes that Naki offered and the 4 T's that Lena just mentioned. I would actually like to elaborate more on timing. I think a challenge a scientists face is not only in early and timely production of science, but also delivery and dissemination. We may produce excellent papers that are quite topical, but we need to also engage in dissemination through policy briefs, workshops, and any other engagement event. And this also has to be timely. It has to come at the right time when the topic that we are discussing are on the policy agenda. Also, in terms of additional challenges, one that I would like to offer is that typically as scientists, we are attracted to ask the questions of what and how. For instance, in my field, ecology and conservation, we like to understand the natural world, how it works, and ask the questions, why is this species there, or why is this ecosystem there? But this might be interesting scientifically, but not necessarily the things that are relevant and important for society. So we should start thinking about a different kind of question. Why? Why is this important, or is it important at all? So the way I try to overcome this challenge is, as spending quite a lot of time in engaging decision makers to offer, before even offering advice, understanding what kind of science they take up, how they process this information, how they make decisions. And this really has helped me in kind of crystallizing what really matters to them, and also how to deliver this information in a way that is understandable, accessible, and also actionable for them.
Thank you, Piero. And again, we will discuss some of these points in the Q&A session that we start just now. But thank you for sharing this initial thoughts. Naki, can I ask you? You worked throughout your career really with highest level policymakers and politicians as well. So you were able to observe the evolution of this science policy interface over many years. And you mentioned in your initial presentation this T model for science and policy, with the upper part being this work of dissemination and making policy impact. So how do you think this upper part of T letter evolved over time? Do you see some patterns? Do you see some changes? How this is changing now in different parts of the world, because you are also participating and contributing not only in Europe but across the world. How do you see it's changing now?
Thank you, Elena. That's a great question. Before I try to answer it, let me just say that I also fully agree with Piero about the importance of asking the right questions about what and how. In some ways, one could almost say that asking the right question is perhaps even more important than providing the answer to the decision makers. So let me now return to your question. My personal view is that there has been an increasing recognition of the importance of science, and in particular evidence-based information in policy making. I think that in particular, ever greater emphasis on the assessments to inform the policy decisions. So I would say that the function of the scientific advice has been also formalized both in public and private sectors. Many companies, many governments around the world have either chief scientific advisors, or they have scientific advisory group. So I think this is all testimony to the fact that science is gaining importance in policy making. But clearly there is huge work left to be done. And I think a great example was actually the tragic COVID pandemic. I think it further emphasized the critical role of science in policy making. I think it highlighted the scientific expertise in understanding and responding to complex and rapidly evolving public health crises. And I think this is an important thing, that it's the high degree of complexity and that it evolves along time. So scientific advice is required all along. So I think this has been scientific advice has been also very important in response strategies, I think, around the world, including the very controversial lockdowns, also from the scientific point of view, vaccination programs and other health measures. But let me just come back to the importance of science advice. I think what is really significant is that seven vaccines have been developed across the world in an incredibly short time. This is a testimony to the great success of science, and I think that has convinced many that without science, as I said at the beginning, there is no future. However, there are huge problems as well, and I think COVID is a good example. Much of the science advice there focused on virology, and I think that other scientific disciplines, social issues, behavioral issues, and other measures that require better public understanding and acceptance have played a much smaller role. And I think this is a great problem in scientific advice mechanisms. So there are these huge challenges to be overcome. I think another one I would like to mention is that science is increasingly politicized, not just in the public debates, I would say also in the policy making. Often science evidence is used to support particular political agendas. Almost, one could say, put it in extreme words, very often politicians choose the scientists to provide advice that have the same, exactly the same views as the political agenda. Now, another huge area of additional work is to improve the communication at all levels, not just with media and public, but also with the policymakers, so that science is correctly understood. And I think what is even more important, correctly interpreted. So I think these are some of the critical issues. Another one that I would like to mention in conclusion is that we shouldn't forget that science is unique in the sense that the scientific process is based on critical evaluation of theories, critical evaluation of data, of the conclusions, even falsification of theories. And I think in the public and in the media, that's often interpreted as the lack of scientific consensus. And I would argue that that's wrong, but we need to communicate all of these things better. So I would say it has positively evolved, scientific advice mechanisms across the public, private, and public sector, but there is a huge work left to be done so that before the evidence can be given appropriate weight and considerations in policy making.
Thank you. Thank you. It's reassuring to hear that you see this positive trend, but at the same time, you also pointed at the chronic lack of action in different areas, including climate change. So I guess many challenges, and you named some of them. Mostly they are not lying in science as such, but they are lying at the interface, and that's what we are discussing in this seminar and sharing our experiences. Lena, you told us very interesting how you basically your daily work is organized when you work with the European Commission in particular, or with other clients, so to say, of your research. Tell us a little bit, how do you think policymakers come to actually use science? How do they choose which scientists they work with? How do they choose when they engage with science and so on? So how do they organize this work in your experience?
Yeah, well, from my experience, it's a lot about trust, and trust is something that takes time and hard work, and also making sure that you're always available as an expert when it's actually needed by the policymakers. And in the case of using the gains model for IIASA's air pollution IIASA's gains model in the EU's air pollution and climate policies, we have actually benefited a lot from our former program director, Marcus Ammans, exceptional ability to foresee the needs of policymakers before they even recognize these needs themselves. Because this has meant that we have been able to have the analytical tools ready by the time that the policymakers actually started looking for this capacity, which has, of course, given us a time advantage in comparison to other institutes and model groups who would then first need to develop these tools. So this it's been very important to that we actually have developed these and that we have a capacity to see these needs before they come to the policy makers table.
Yeah, so the advice to other scientists, possibly to early career scientists, if they want to work with policymakers and make policy impact, is to, as Anaki also emphasized, that to be sort of forward-looking and to be anticipatory, in a sense, like, yeah, anticipating the future needs, not the current needs, and addressing the future needs. So that's a great insight, I think. I think we sometimes underestimate the importance of that. So great that you highlighted that. Piero, you mentioned the importance of delivery and dissemination, and you mentioned policy briefs and workshops as, of course, conventional channels, or channels that have become actually conventional for scientists to communicate their results. There is a less conventional way that is becoming more and more popular these days, and this is what is called science activism. And we know that also you are participating in some of these activities that can be referred as science activism, I suppose. So would you like to tell us a little bit what motivates you to do it? What do you want to achieve with that? And how do you see that as part of your science work, if you see it like that?
Sure. So my research field is called conservation science, and its objective is to provide evidence base to understand and conserve life on Earth. So it's mission-driven, it's a normative discipline. It's not just concerned with describing how species and ecosystems are going extinct or ecological processes collapsing. Because of this mission, it makes natural sense that we would like to engage with decision makers to advocate for the use of best available evidence to do something about the ecological crisis. Unfortunately, actually, let's start with the positive. Fortunately, there is plenty of options for scientists in my field to engage with the public and with practitioners. And I had multiple experiences. I'll mention two. First is I enjoyed supporting professional societies in their policy and science advocacy. An example in my field is the Society for Conservation Biology. And in Europe, the European chapter, basically what we did was dissemination through policy brief, as well as giving public lectures, and also trying to engage and meet in person national and international governments to basically advocate for the use of best available evidence. And one example we had, for instance, was engaging with the Commission and a member of European Parliament at the time when the last EU Common Agricultural Policy reform was drafted. Another instance of science activism, well, maybe it's not so much science activism, it's more kind of science policy interface, has been IIASA, which is the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. The IIASA plenary, like the IPCC plenary, essentially is composed of nearly all countries' delegation, and it basically gives mandate to a group of experts to address topical research questions, and the experts then are tasked with basically providing a knowledge synthesis on those questions. In my experience, working with IIASA, once a draft synthesis document is adopted and becomes an official document of IIASA, this was really an eye-opener in terms of knowledge exchange and co-production of knowledge with decision makers. And also opened an opportunity for doing more proper science advocacy, because it gave me the network and the opportunity to engage closer with the European Commission and several governments and build the trust that Lena was mentioning before. As in, once they got to know me and my science and my work, then it was easier to engage further on and do more work together.
Thank you. Interesting. Naki, can I come back to you, and can we continue this discussion? Some years ago, when we were thinking of science impact, we mainly or even exclusively were thinking about communicating and interacting with policymakers and contributing to the policymaking process. So that's how we saw the impact that science can make. Increasingly now, we think about a much broader communication and much broader engagement with the society at large. What do you think about that? It's not only science activism, advocacy that Piero just mentioned, it's also communicating with, simply communicating with the general public. I think there are other dilemmas there. So you highlighted some dilemmas or paradoxes here. There is yet another dilemma that on the one hand, of course, all scientists would, I think I can say it with confidence, would like to share their knowledge, would like to share their results, would like to, the general public, actually everybody, to know what they are doing and know the results, know the insights. But the dilemma is, we know that any scientific knowledge is not complete. It can never be complete. And any new discovery can actually change completely the conclusions and ideas that we had based on the previous knowledge. So there's always this, and we observed that in the history of science so many times. So I think scientists know that, they are aware of that, and therefore they are reluctant very often to make simple and blunt statements and also engage in the science advocacy and activism. So what do you think about this dilemma?
That's a great question, Helena. And let me just first of all say that I agreed with everything that Piero said. I can subscribe to all of it. And I think responding to your question, I would say, we simply have to act on the best information, best knowledge. This is why I'm a big fan of assessments, even though I know the tails of the distribution of scientific knowledge, the extremes, so probably on both sides, whatever the topic is. So I think that's related a little bit to your question. But I would argue that it is our duty to provide the best knowledge, even knowing that the knowledge will improve in time. And again, I think because Piero mentioned the IPCC negotiations, I think they're not always smooth. Let me say it that way. I believe I have some wounds to show from that. But from my point of view, this is really essential. These kind of processes of communicating both the scientific uncertainty and that what we really know. And in case of climate, the basic facts are here, even though in great detail a lot has changed. So. And if I may also comment on Lena very briefly, because she talked about the gains and range model. I think this is really perhaps the best example of how integrated assessment modeling can influence policy. After all, the European transboundary air pollution policy was based on the scenarios made with that model. So I think this is another case in point. We'll probably know much more than the model can capture today, but it is important, I think, to communicate that. So my answer then to the question about whether science should be activist, I would argue in many occasions, yes. I think in many occasions it is appropriate the science becomes activist, especially when these are the challenges of what I would call social steering, where social steering is needed, where science cannot answer all of the questions, and yet society at large needs to be well informed to make the right decisions. And then, maybe one can also say, we as researchers and the scientific communities are also part of the society. So I would say it is also our responsibility to participate in the social processes of decision finding. So I would say that's would be my framework. Nevertheless, I think there is a caveat, and I would like to share it with you. Scientists often have much deeper, and researchers have deeper knowledge at hand about the challenging problems compared to the general public, even policymakers and so on. Nevertheless, they are not necessarily better at making decisions. So I think, there are ample evidence where science was actually wrong in providing the advice. The classical one I would like to mention is the statement that heavier than air flying machines will never be possible, just a few years before Wright brothers took to the air. So I think we need to be always aware of that caveat. This is why I would argue that evidence-based assessments like the IPCC are the way to go. At the same time, in the sense of activism, I think scientists need to provide also science-based opinions. But as long as the rigor of assessments and evidence base is separated from the personal scientific opinions, I think this is a good way forward. But we must make sure that those things are kept apart. Now, let me just conclude responding to you by mentioning the European Science Advice Mechanism that divides those two functions. So we as scientific advisors, there are 7 of us, we provide scientific opinion, but that is rooted in the evidence-based assessments of a consortium of European Academies of Sciences before we give it over to the College of Commissioners. So these two functions are clearly separated, and I think that's important.
Yeah, thank you. That's indeed an important clarification here. I will ask a similar question, or the same question to Lena, but before I do that, we are approaching to the time when we can also take questions from the audience. I see already there is one, but I would like to encourage also the audience that is following us to use this opportunity and ask their questions using the Q&A function of the webinar. But before we get to those questions, Lena, what do you think about communicating science? You already mentioned in your initial presentation the importance of communicating uncertainty. I would like to come back to that. On the one hand, yes, that would provide transparency, which, as we know, is a good basis for trust. On the other hand, would it not somehow, at least in minds of some people, mean that scientists themselves don't know much what they are talking about? Or is there a risk that by being more explicit about uncertainty, we can actually, rather than strengthening our, let's say, position of authority and the knowledge that we are communicating, rather we would weaken that? So what do you think about this challenge?
No, I do think we have to be open about uncertainty, but I think that uncertainty should never be used as an excuse for not moving forward. But I think that what we have seen in the processes in the European climate change processes is that that by speaking openly about the uncertainty with the different stakeholders, within the Commission and with the stakeholders and with the scientists, that it is possible to acknowledge the uncertainty, but at the same time actually also agree on moving forward on the best available knowledge that we have. So I think that this is really very important that we, because I think there is a danger if we don't acknowledge the uncertainty. There is a danger that that we get the questions of, so why is this person saying something different from this person, and that kind of information is being misused for actually delaying action. But yeah, with that said, I think it's very important that scientists communicate with the civil society, with different action groups and the NGOs. And for example, I communicate quite regularly with some NGOs like the European Environmental Bureau in Brussels, because I also see them as a way to, they do a lot of very good work informing, for example, EU parliamentarians and other stakeholders about different topics. And sometimes they need hard facts, so they ask me for some inputs and also to fact check some statements, which I do, but I never put my name or anything to this, because I think that our respective roles are very different, and that this is something that I feel that both they and I respect, because my role is to give them input based on science, and where they need to trust that my answers are based on facts and not opinions. So I would refrain from providing input on any subjects that would be outside of my expertise. And this role, their role, is then to help conveying important messages to the policymakers, which often we scientists, we have limited time to do this. So I think this is a very important role for them. And I find that this collaboration works very well as long as these respective rules are mutually respected.
Thank you, Lena. So it's again about proper separation of different functions. And of course, the idea is that this whole ecosystem should function in a smooth and seamless way. So the question is how to achieve that, of course. Great. A little bit changing the topic and coming back to COVID, which we mentioned already today, but remembering the experience of COVID, And Naki pointed already that this was really a test for many of our systems, and it also showed that how science is important, but also how communication of science is important, and all the challenges that are related to that. I would like to ask you, Piero, what was your observations in that process? How do you think we learned from COVID as scientists in terms of communicating our science? Will we do better as a scientific community next time when a similar crisis happens? I guess there is no doubt that it will happen sooner or later. So what do you think we learned from COVID?
Yes. So fundamentally, science advances to making mistakes. That is the whole point of the scientific methods. We formulate hypotheses based on observations. We produce experiments to test these hypotheses, and then we discard those that are not supported by the data. And then we improve, we iterate this process to improve our understanding. It is all nice and good in a laboratory setting where you have controlled experiments, and therefore you can make mistakes effectively, invalidate your hypothesis, for instance, about the virulence of a pathogen, its evolution and adaptation, without essentially having any real world consequences, without having no risk for people or for the economy. However, you cannot replicate a pandemic in a lab. That's why scientists resorted to computer simulations, which are fundamental to make scenarios and forecasts. But these rely on assumptions about important parameters such as the basic reproduction number of the virus, the recovery rate, fatality, and so on. So especially at the beginning, when we didn't really know very much about this virus, and little was known, but there was a need, an imperative need to take decisions based on whatever was available. Many scientists made different predictions because each of them had their own best guesses and limited data to act upon. Some of these differences were due to epistemic uncertainties. That means use of different data and methods. And this was obviously natural because this was a truly multidisciplinary natural experiment, if you like. Computational biologists, demographers, virologists, immunologists, all of them had something to offer. All of them were relying on slightly different methodologies, and it's natural they would come up with different conclusions. As Elena and Naki pointed out before, it's important to be very honest about these uncertainties. Also, the uncertainty, they may not be epistemological, but ontological, as in including the unconscious bias from scientists. After all, we are humans, and humans can be biased. And so we had to use some kind of expert opinion in a Bayesian process, if you like. And of course, as human, we may be more directed towards one of the extreme of the distribution that Naki was mentioning before. So if there is something I would like to change, and that I think we learned from the pandemic, is that we need to be really more honest about communicating our assumptions and uncertainties. Too often we've been seeing scientists or government officials reporting scientific evidence behind the policy decisions, talking with overconfidence about their decisions. On one end, I understand this. If you're asking a lot to people, like a lockdown, and basically giving very tough restrictions, so you may want to be very confident about what you're saying, because if you say, I'm asking you to make a very, like your life is going to be much difficult, but I'm not so sure about this. Obviously, this kind of is problematic. But on the other end, what happened is that many different opinions came about, or scientific evidence, and typically with strenuous defense of those predictions. And of course, I can understand how people became a bit disillusioned on science when some of these predictions didn't materialize, and there was a bit of kind of a conflicting messaging coming from science. So once again, I think we need to be a bit more honest about our uncertainty, and also accept that alternative predictions made by different scientific advisors or research groups may be just as valid and might be even more correct based on their own data and methods.
Thank you, Piero. And that brings me actually to one of the questions that I'm seeing in the Q&A now. From Eric Kemp Benedict, and I think you partially already addressed it, but if you want to add on this, even in cases where science is clear, the implications for policy and society more generally often is not. How do you recommend we handle ambiguity in the relationship between physical and biological science and socio-political processes? Would you like to comment on this, Pierre?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think I refer to my own field, ecology and conservation is already quite complex. It's much more difficult than physics. It's much more messy than physics and other disciplines like chemistry, because there is many different drivers and feedback loop and complex system dynamics. But perhaps the most messy aspect of conservation is people and the decision-making behavior. I think we need to get better at understanding the cognitive process of how people make decisions, and also the formal processes of how these decision makers adopt this decision. For instance, drafting and implementing legislation or internal regulation the private sector put themselves on, and try to understand from their perspective how they're going to take up this information and make choices. So it's a very good point. There is a lot of ambiguity, as this question points out, specifically on the transfer to social. And I think this requires additional skills and expertise that many of us don't have.
Thank you, Piero. Another question from our long-term friend from Sweden, Uno Svedin. Hello, Uno. Great to have you here with us. And your question is, Uno is asking us to comment on meta changes in different parts of science and decision-making systems. I think Naki started to speak about it, saying that the role of science is increasing, at least in some parts. But Naki, would you like to expand and elaborate on this further?
Yes, thank you. And hi, Uno. Actually, Uno and I saw each other at the Swedish Academy in Stockholm last week. So let me also mention that Uno was the secretary to the Swedish member organization to IIASA for many years. So, my point of view is, given that we are so late on science, technology, innovation for achieving sustainable future, really transformational change is required. And this is perhaps how I interpret the question about meta. We need meta changes in science. And, to keep an answer short to this exceedingly important question, I would argue that we need science for transformation, and arguably we don't have it yet, but we also need to transform science. So I think there are two dimensions to that question to be fit for the challenges that we have, because world is facing multiple crises that need to be solved together in order to achieve synergies. Because if we solve everything in silos, I think we will probably fail, and this is probably perhaps the reason why we are so late in implementing climate agreement and the 2030 agenda. So I would say new meta thinking among the scientific disciplines in the direction of transformation and disruptive change is called for.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Naki. And that brings us to exactly to design of those systems and how to redesign them to make them fit for purpose. Yeah. We have another question from Tiago Brito on YouTube, which I would like Lena to address. And the question is, how well do you think scientists are prepared to interact with policymakers? So I think Lena is very well prepared and she's interacting with them on a daily basis. But if you take it more broadly, in science systems and education, do you think we are paying enough attention to this question? What are the skills that are needed? And should we enhance certain skills? What do you think?
Yeah, I will. Yes, I mean, I think it's really important that we communicate, in particular, uncertainties, but also that we are able to do it in such a way that also the receiving party actually understands that uncertainty is something that we actually have to live with, and that we, even if we have this uncertainty, we still need to find ways to move forward. That's one aspect of it, and another aspect is that something that we have already mentioned a bit is for when it comes to the research, that that research must be allowed to be active rather than reactive in terms of science funding and so on. And I think this is also something that we need to communicate better, that we shouldn't only make prescriptive research, but there should also be funding back to actually be able to to be active instead of just responding to needs of policymakers. We have to be able to, there must be room for researchers to also ask the questions and to put the questions on the table to the policymakers.
Yeah, indeed, and that indeed one aspect of this or this transformation of our systems that I think Naki also mentioned. And I think it's great that you pointed that, and I think we should really emphasize it, that it takes two to tango. So scientists can communicate, scientists can develop their communication skills better and better, which is of course important and then needs to be done. But there is also a receiving side, and the receiving side is policymakers, and the receiving side is also citizens. And scientific literacy is something that is really, really essential for the fact that, for them to understand the science and what we are communicating, and especially this communicating uncertainty. So the receiving side should be prepared to understand it right. Otherwise, I think there can be a lot of confusion rather than being helpful. Excellent. So I think we have discussed really very, very interesting topics today, and we have covered many things. I would like to ask now each of our speakers to really take 30 seconds, and please use only 30 seconds. If you can say, if this would be something that you could do, what would be one thing that you would change in the existing science to science policy interface? Is there one thing that, imagine that everything is possible, is there one thing that we could change in our current system so that we increase the effectiveness of science policy interface? Can you give very brief answers? Maybe I start with Naki.
Yes, that's tough in 30 seconds, but I'll try. I think we need to work at exponential rates, disruptive rates, in strengthening the policy science interface. And I think that needs to reflect the local realities and needs to be rigorously evidence-based from my point of view, from global to local. And it needs to be transformational, as we discussed before, and impactful. So I think, let me just conclude by saying that for that, we will need convincing and coherent roadmaps. We didn't talk about that. I mean, I think we need time-bound plans of how that are science involved. As I said before, not having a plan is a bad plan. So I would conclude by saying we need to act locally, but always think globally and use evidence-based to avoid negative social and planetary tipping.
Thank you, Naki. Lena?
Yes, I mean, I fully agree with Naki on all the points. I think time is of essence, and we have to realize that we cannot wait until we have all the answers to everything. We really need to move forward with the knowledge that we have. I think that would be my
message. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Piero?
Thanks. Actually, I'm going to take this minute to also provide my perspective of the question from Tiago Brito on skill set. So I think we need to appreciate the facts typically don't change mind. Humans struggle with taking in complex information, and also many struggle to make sense of statistics and probability, and are more likely to infer generalization from individual stories or even use case studies local cases and intuition. So I think there is an important role for our scientists in understanding cognitive science, to understand the power of values, emotions, and experience in swaying minds and changing collective behavior. I don't suggest that we all become expert in cognitive science, but at least we should get acquainted with what is known about how humans make sense of new information and how this information is incorporated into decision-making. I also suspect that in many cases, science communication and science activism would then be most effectively done in collaboration with, or even entirely delegated to experts of cognitive science as opposed to empiricists like us.
It's a great take-home message, Piero. Thank you. And thank you all speakers for sharing your thoughts and experience with us today. I hope the audience enjoyed the discussion. We also count on your opinion to improve our future events, our future webinars. So please answer our survey that will pop up in your browser after you leave this meeting. The survey is anonymous and the results will help us to improve our future events like this. Also, I want to say the video of this webinar will be available on the IIASA website and the YouTube channel. We will also share links that to projects and different facts that were mentioned today. And we hope to see you again at our next IIASA webinar, which will take place already on the 26th of July. And you can follow us on social media for any updates. Thank you very much for attending this webinar. Have a great day. Goodbye.